Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Tonight, I believe, is April 16th, a Tuesday, 2024, and tonight's class is on, I believe, the creation and early stages of NATO.
Yeah, it's on the creation and history of NATO. So this class is on NATO sort of in its entirety, just kind of an outline, especially as they're going to have their, I believe, 75th summit this year in Washington, D.C. So we thought it was relevant to give this class, make sure comrades knew this history. So what we'll be learning tonight is we will dive into the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the problems therein. We'll learn about the history of NATO during the Cold War and how the alliance postured itself against the USSR and the Warsaw Pact, and the different ways that it was sort of involved with the interventions and different geopolitics of that time. And lastly, we will explore the history of NATO within the past about 33 years during the period of American Unipolarity and how NATO exposed itself to not be a defensive organization in the wake of the counter-revolution in the USSR. So we'll go ahead and get started with the first section, which is on the origins and creation of NATO. I'll go ahead and read a few slides. So starting off at the aftermath of World War II and peaceful coexistence refused. In September of 1945, the Second World War finally came to an end with the formal surrender of Japan following the Soviet invasion of the Sakhalin and Kuril Islands, as well as Korea. The United States had also dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan and used the atomic bombings as the pretext for ending the war, snubbing the Soviets. Almost immediately following World War II, U.S.-Soviet relations were off to a bad start. In the early spring of 1946, so remember this is only months after the end of World War II, Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, which was ironically called Sinews of Peace, even though that's not what it was promoting at all, echoing Joseph Goebbels' propaganda about an Iron Curtain during World War II. The United States and Britain grew increasingly hawkish towards the Soviet Union, and as diplomatic relations grew tense, the McCarthy period began in the United States to root out the communists in America and begin the Cold War at home. West Germany and the Nazis. Following the Soviet victory in Berlin in May of 1945, the land within the borders of former Nazi Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation, controlled each by Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The Soviets held Northeast Germany, including the city of Berlin, which was also divided 4 ways within the confines of the Soviet occupation zone. Nonetheless, the Soviets got to work on denazification and demilitarization of their occupation zones. In the western sectors of Germany, however, Nazis were saved and recruited into the Western institutions. Former Nazi General Adolf Husinger was allowed to work as a research consultant for the Office of the United States Chief of Counsel for War Crimes and served as a military advisor to the first Chancellor of West Germany when it was established. He would serve as lieutenant and inspector general in the new Bundeswehr in the 1950s, which was the new rearmed West German military. It was very controversial. And as chairman of the NATO Military Committee and the chief of staff of NATO up until 1964. In 1948, the Western governments agreed to unite their occupation zones into the formation of West Germany. Many Nazis were incorporated into the government, and much of the government itself was a continuation of the former Nazi regime. Other former Nazis, such as General Hans Spiegel, Sturmfuhrer Dr. Eberhard Taubert, Nazi Admiral and U-boat Commander Friedrich Guggenberger, and many more were recruited into NATO positions after its founding. And you can see even more on the side. It includes Husinger, Spiegel, Steinhoff, etc. So we'll go to the next slide. Vital Problems of Our Time from Yuri Yuriev.
Fearing shadows or pursuing them. No sooner had the U.S. State Department begun to draft the North Atlantic Treaty than it was evident against whom it was spearheaded. The treaty was engineered in the stifling atmosphere of artificially provoked alarm over the alleged threat of invasion from the East looming over Western Europe. It was no easy task to create such an atmosphere after the last war, in which the Soviet people had displayed untold staunchness and heroism and suffered the greatest losses in the fight against Nazi barbarism, winning the respect and admiration of peoples the world over. It required the prolonged efforts of a costly propaganda machine on both sides of the Atlantic. For days and hours on end, the fear that Russians would use force to impose Soviet system on all countries was implanted in the minds of the common people in the West. This fictitious threat of a Soviet military attack has always been the cornerstone of NATO propaganda. All speeches, articles, and books by NATO official propagandists are based on this premise. In determining the main direction of the campaign to prepare the ground for setting up NATO and cementing the alliance for many years, U.S. foreign policymakers had to reckon with the psychology of the people to be taken in by this campaign. The soil of the European continent had been soaked in blood. Europeans had gone through the misery of 2 world wars in the 20th century. These tragic events have left an indelible imprint on the hearts and minds of the Europeans. An acute sense of insecurity, skepticism, and disbelief. This was the psychological profile of many people in Western Europe during the first post-war years when the war wounds were still raw. This made it much easier for U.S. diplomacy to engineer the North Atlantic Alliance. In both world wars, the United States occupied the advantageous position of third party during the most trying bloody battles. And only at a concluding stage of the war did it become directly involved in military operations and send its troops overseas, thereby getting in on the post-war settlement. Therefore, the urge for a closer union of the old and new worlds became a sort of idée fixe for many European policymakers who were ready to make serious concessions to the United States to bring it to pass. After the war in Germany, Italy, and Japan were dropped from the list of the great powers, while Britain and France emerged seriously weakened. This has radically changed the thinking of U.S. policy shapers to a global scale. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 marked Washington's complete abandonment of isolationism. From then on, the spheres of U.S. interests embraced every region of the world. The Vandenberg Resolution, passed by U.S. Senate on June 11, 1948, sanctioned for the first time in U.S. history United States direct participation in regional alliances outside the American continent. This was tantamount to assuming far-reaching responsibility, including military commitments in times of peace.
So 1948 to 1949, the year that birthed NATO. The 1948 Czech Revolution and the establishment of a people's democracy represented a victory for the international communist movement in Eastern Europe and was smeared as a communist coup by the West. In the same year, the Soviets began a blockade on West Berlin. Stalin explained, "The Western powers' decision to introduce a separate currency in West Germany is a deliberate provocation aimed at undermining the economic stability of the Eastern zone. We cannot allow West Berlin to become a base for hostile activities against the socialist camp. The blockade is a necessary measure to protect our interests and maintain the integrity of East Germany." In a reactionary response, the Western powers airlifted supplies to West Berlin in a highly publicized moment, Cold War propaganda. Andrei Vyshinsky, Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister, said, "The Berlin airlift is a futile attempt by Western powers to challenge our blockade of West Berlin. Their efforts to supply West Berlin by air only serve to escalate tensions and deepen the division of Germany. We stand firm in our commitment to defending the socialist achievements of East Germany and countering Western imperialism." In the midst of the airlift, which lasted into May of 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was drafted and signed, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization came into being. Founding members included Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, United Kingdom, and the United States. Greece and Turkey would join. I don't think it was in the same year, but it was a couple years after that. And West Germany joined officially in 1955. And with that, we'll go ahead and stop for our first round of questions and comments.
All right, I see hands going up, which is always a good sign.
Okay. I just wanted to kind of bring it to connect it to today. I mean, we see the same things in Western propaganda that Russia is not going to stop at Ukraine, that they're going to go through Poland, that they're going to do this, they're going to swing through the Baltic states. It's literally the same propaganda that has been used before. So just wanted to point that out.
All right, thank you for that.
Yeah, so it kind of connects with today with the stuff with NATO, you know. They're kind of intervening in places they shouldn't be with what is it? It started with the airlifts where they kind of went through territory they shouldn't be, and I think it kind of continued like that, you know. It kind of connects like someone said that earlier ago. Forgot who it was. It kind of connects with the modern day policies we have.
All right, thank you for that.
This is very important. I didn't find out the whole history until I had a knee-jerk reaction supporting East Germany and the Soviet Union, being that I was a communist. So I didn't really know what was going on. Whatever they did, I supported them. Then I found out the truth. The truth, the truth gave evidence of our position. Okay, what happened? Stalin said Germany should not be divided. You should all know this. That was the position. They never called for the German Democratic Republic. This is interesting. Stalin said it should not be divided. It should be demilitarized and neutral. That was the plan that the four powers had for Germany after the war. What happened is that we had one currency, the German mark, in all of Germany. And you should Google this to give facts to what I'm saying. The West, this has to be explained very carefully. The West unilaterally changed the German mark in its zone. So now you had the Western zone with a different German mark than the Eastern zone. So it was the United States and the Allies that did the change. Once you had the change, that means that the East German mark was less. So without a wall, they just walked over the line, people from West Berlin and Western Germany. They bought all the goods that were in the East that was subsidized by socialism. And they went back in the West zone and they sold them. This is interesting. So they were making money off of this, black marketeers. I mean, this is an important thing, what I'm trying to say. I think people should Google this because it was the reason for the division of Germany. Then we had the Berlin airlift, which was before the GDR was set up. I'm pretty sure about this. That was the Western zone. U.S. planes were getting stuff because West Berlin was inside the Eastern zone. Remember, West Berlin was inside the Eastern zone of Germany. So this was a punishment for them changing their currency. Then the Eastern zone was forced to have their own currency. Once they had their own currency, they had their own state. So that should be understood. Stalin never called for the division of Germany. The West made it happen. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Comrade Angelo. We'll take these two hands and, of course, get back to the presentation. I just wanted to say quickly, I know they took von Braun into NASA. They taught that us in school, and I don't know if it's true, but apparently he didn't even care about Nazism. Hitler let him build rockets, so he did it. I don't know if that's true or not, but I never learned about former Nazis being members of like NATO management, and that's shocking.
Have there been any like inter-imperialist conflicts since the start of NATO? Or did NATO kind of consolidate the interests of all imperialist powers?
That's a very good question. If you know, put your hand up.
Yeah, it definitely consolidated the world, imperialist market. After 1945, the position was such that the United States and Soviet Union emerged as the two superpowers, and all Western capitalist countries basically became subservient to the United States. This is like a really simplification of it, but you can definitely do some more research and see that this is the way that it turned out.
All right, thank you for that.
Yeah, there have been a number of inter-imperialist conflicts since the creation of NATO, and sometimes maybe the situation, it's arguable one side or another. You have Britain, for example, with the Falklands and Argentina, which could be argued as Argentina's. You have the Iraq-Iran conflict, which is the same Iran now, which you could argue plays a much more positive role. But back then, the United States was funding both Iran and Iraq. Saddam Hussein was the ally of the United States. Well, at the same time, Reagan sold weapons to Iran to fund the Contras to fight the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And a lot of the world in the 20th century was divided because of the socialist camp and the national liberation movements. So countries like Yemen, there was the South Yemen and North Yemen. And South Yemen was aligned with the Soviet Union. And now North Yemen is where the Houthis movement is. You had countries like Ethiopia. But many of the national liberation movements, we would argue, are not inter-imperialist. For example, the national liberation of South Africa, of Vietnam.
60 seconds.
And my on time. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of give an answer and say I don't know if there's inter-imperialist conflicts in the same way we would understand for like World War I, but I mean there was still different policy disagreements even within NATO. France left basically like the executive of it. You'll see it in the presentation in the 60s over or maybe it was in the 50s over the rearmament of West Germany, and they joined again later on, but it was something that there was still some conflict even within NATO. But for the most part, there was the NATO bloc, then there was the Warsaw Pact, then of course, especially after the Sino-Soviet split, there was the sort of non-aligned movement in the world. So for the most part, it was NATO against the Warsaw Pact and the rest of the world in different ways.
All right, thank you for that, comrade.
Just one quick clarification. There's this thing amongst the left where it stated that both Saddam and Pol Pot were supported by the U.S., but if you go back to declassified CIA documents, they've always been considered enemies of the state to the United States Department of Defense and White House and Pentagon and whatnot. Just wanted to clarify real quick.
No, thank you for that. I think they'll work with anyone that if they get their way. All right, Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
I really know more about this than most people. I have degrees in this. And remember, the Cold War started in 1947. And it started in the United States. The Truman Doctrine, that's what it was called. Get that straight. The first thing they did was put into prison leaders of the Communist Party. That was internally. It was connected to what was going on in 49, and so all that was planned ahead. Now, inter-imperialists, we're getting things confused here. NATO was only for Europe. That's all it was. Had nothing to do with Latin America, nothing to do with Asia, nothing to do with Africa. So they were solidified in Europe under NATO. What happened with the England and Argentina and the Falkland Islands, that has nothing to do with NATO. Nothing, zero to do with NATO. So let's not get things confused. All right? I hope everybody understands that. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification, comrade. All right, if there's no hands, if we want to get to the next section.
All right. History of NATO, Cold War. Early years of NATO, the Korean War. NATO's involvement in the Korean War was indirect, primarily through the participation of its member states in the United Nations Command, UNC. The UNC was established in 1950 to coordinate the military efforts of various countries in support of the Republic of Korea against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Several NATO member states, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Turkey, and others, contributed troops and resources to the UNC. They did so under the auspices of the UN Security Council resolution condemning North Korea's invasion of South Korea and calling for collective action to repel the supposed aggression. While NATO as an organization did not formally commit forces to the Korean War, many of its member states played significant roles in the conflict. The war served as a test of NATO's collective defense principles and demonstrated the willingness of NATO countries to intervene against the Soviet Union and socialist revolutions even outside of the NATO treaty area. German rearmament. As the Cold War intensified and the Korean War broke out in 1950, there was growing pressure from the United States and some European countries, notably France, to allow West Germany to rearm and contribute to Western defense efforts against the perceived Soviet threat. France, in particular, was concerned about the prospect of a rearmed Germany and sought to prevent it from becoming a threat to French security. In 1950, French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman proposed the creation of a European Defense Community, EDC, which would include West Germany as a member alongside France, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The EDC would have its own unified military force under joint control, separate from NATO but complementary to it. However, the EDC proposal faced significant opposition, both domestically within France and from other NATO members, notably the United States and the United Kingdom. Some feared that a separate European military force might weaken NATO's cohesions and dilute American influence in European security affairs. As a compromise, the Paris Agreements were signed in 1954, leading to the establishment of the Western European Union, WEU, which integrated West Germany into the defense structures of NATO while providing for a degree of European control over its military forces. The WEU served as a transitional arrangement until West Germany's full integration into NATO in 1955. Vital Problems of Our Time, The Evolution of NATO by Yuri Yuriev. What Germany's participation in NATO leads to. When the North Atlantic Treaty was being signed, its sponsors categorically denied any possibility of including West Germany. They went so far as to hint that the alliance would be not only an anti-Soviet instrument, but also an additional guarantee against the resurgence of German militarism. The then Foreign Minister of France, Robert Schuman, speaking in the National Assembly during the debate of the treaty ratification, said, "I have been asked time and again whether it would be possible to allow West Germany to enter NATO. This question cannot be asked not only now but in the future either. Germany has no peace treaty. She has no arms, will not have any. France and her allies cannot even think of Germany being allowed to participate in NATO as a nation capable of her own defense or the defense of other nations." These words now seem rather strange, to say the least. The people who uttered them must either be childishly naive, which in terms of politics is worse than a crime, or utterly cynical. Today, West Germany is the biggest military power in Western Europe. It has an army of 500,000 strong, equipped with the latest in war techniques. This was the result of contradictions between the victor powers and their blind policy of anti-communism, which has been cunningly used by German militarism. The Ruhr steel magnates, the generals steeled in aggressive world wars, reactionary bureaucratic, permeated with chauvinist Greater Germany spirit, remnants of the Nazi leadership apparatus who escaped justice. They are the ones who constituted the biggest part of anti-Soviet forces in post-war Europe. It was they who occupied key positions in the government bodies of the Federal Republic of Germany. The creation in Europe of a military political bloc under U.S. aegis, spearheaded against the USSR, was bound to compel its leaders sooner or later to turn to the services of those who were well experienced at waging wars against the Soviet Union and who, despite their double defeat, still harbor illusions of revenge. The split of the anti-Hitler coalition was a starting point of the revanchist forces' resurgence. These forces do not confine themselves to offering their services to an anti-Soviet crusade. They also resort to blackmail, hinting at the possibility of finding a key to reunification in the East and a return to what almost amounts to the Rapallo policy. There are many statesmen in the West who fear the turning of yesterday's aggressor into a present and future ally. However, they are under the impression that the federal Germany's inclusion in NATO can firmly tie her to the West. It should also be borne in mind that the creation of NATO and the beginning of the Korean War, 1949-50, unleashed an unprecedented armaments race, with the United States setting the fashion. The burden of military expenditures which NATO member states had to shoulder, at the time many of them were waging colonial wars, seriously slowed down the rate of their economic reconstruction and worsened their position on foreign markets. Under the circumstances, West Germany, who was free of that burden, found herself in an extremely favorable position. This is why the idea of German contribution to the West military effort, put forward by U.S. diplomacy as a plan of German rearmaments, has found a positive response among certain business circles in Western Europe who hoped, with Bonn entering the armaments race as the capital of West Germany, somewhat to alleviate their own burden and level out competition opportunities. The leaders of NATO member countries have tried many a plan for federal Germany's remilitarization. Its basic principle was military integration, an organic merging of the West German army with the armed forces of the Atlantic powers. Some people thought it would bind West German aggressive circles hand and foot and guarantee the Allies from any unpleasant surprises. It was envisioned at first to limit this integrated organization to 6 countries of Little Europe, creating the European Army, which would incorporate the smallest possible contingents of West German troops headed by joint staffs. However, as the first draft was discussed, these small contingents grew to several divisions. The public in France rightly considered the European defense community an instrument for liquidation of the French army, which at the time was waging a bloody war in Indochina, and the joint staffs, a tool enabling federal Germany sooner or later to grab the dominating position in Little Europe. It was for this reason that the French National Assembly refused to ratify the draft of the treaty on August 30th, 1957.
The early years of NATO, formation of the Warsaw Pact. Following West Germany joining NATO, the Warsaw Pact was formed in 1955 and represented a consolidation of the collective security of Eastern Europe and the USSR under the leadership of the USSR. For countries like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and others in Eastern Europe, joining the Warsaw Pact was a necessary measure to counterbalance the threat posed by NATO and West Germany's rearmament. They viewed the alliance as a means to ensure their own security and protect the gains of socialism in the face of Western capitalist aggression. The formation of the Warsaw Pact significantly intensified the tensions of the Cold War by solidifying the division of Europe into 2 opposing blocs. With both NATO and the Warsaw Pact firmly established, the ideological and military confrontation between the capitalist West and the communist East reached new heights. The very next year, a fascist counter-revolution in Hungary was put down by the Soviet Union and in French Indonesia. The USSR-backed Viet Minh had just defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu, and the American troops were beginning to train South Vietnamese troops. The socialist revolution in Cuba, 90 miles from the leading state of NATO, the United States, was soon to be underway as well. NATO during the Cold War. Internal problems in NATO arise. In 1966, French President Charles de Gaulle announced France's withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command structure. De Gaulle believed that NATO, particularly under American leadership, did not sufficiently respect French sovereignty and strategic autonomy. He recognized NATO as dominated by the United States and believed that France's interests were not adequately represented within the organization. As a result, France pursued an independent defense policy and sought to assert its own military capabilities separate from NATO's command structure. However, France remained a member of NATO and continued to participate in political and military cooperation with the alliance, eventually rejoining NATO's integrated military command in 2009 under President Nicolas Sarkozy. NATO during the Cold War. France foreign interventions. Whilst NATO was not officially carrying out military interventions collectively throughout the Cold War, the member states of NATO were carrying out various wars and genocidal projects around the world and were supporting each other throughout. This includes the United States interventions in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, British and French interventions in their own colonies abroad, and covert stay-behind networks in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union as part of Operation Gladio. Military exercises such as the Exercise Reforger, or the return of forces to Germany, exercises in West Germany, as well as Operations Able Archer in 1983 and 84, served to intimidate the Soviet Union and show the ability of NATO to deploy to the Warsaw Pact borders rapidly and respond to the paranoid thought of a Soviet invasion. The Able Archer exercises actually resulted in near nuclear conflagrations, as the USSR thought it was a real military escalation. Throughout the Cold War, broken arrows and near nuclear incidents were common, as the nuclear arms race continued and tensions grew. It can be observed that the presence of the Warsaw Pact and the power of the Soviet Union kept NATO at bay throughout the Cold War era. The counter-revolution in the USSR and Eastern Europe brought in major part by Gorbachev, brought that era to an end, and NATO actions became more reckless and overt abroad.
And I'm just going to quickly say, does anybody know what made the difference between the West accepting a Nazi into NATO and not versus charging them for a crime? Does anybody know what tipped the scale? Thank you. All right, Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
Yeah, I want to mention, very important, that's when we had a multipolar world. You heard of the word multipolar today. That was a multipolar world. After 91, it was a unipolar world. The United States had complete power to do what it wanted on the whole planet. For the first time, the recent actions in Ukraine by Russia was the beginning of the end of a unipolar world. That's why there's all this discussion. And what we call, and then it's good to go back to a multipolar world, because the chances to stop American imperialism are greater now. Okay, and there are some communist parties, I don't want to get off the topic, who don't see it that way. They see it as imperialism. They don't understand the dialectics of the situation. Thank you.
Thank you for that insight, Comrade Angelo.
Yeah, to answer your question, actually, the big difference is anti-communism. The Western powers basically accepted anyone who was a fervent anti-communist. They would work with literally any and all forces as long as they prevented a actual threat to the Soviet Union. That's why they also recruited left-wing groups to do the same kind of work in the propaganda sphere. They would push and prop up these groups that were anti-Soviet in all of these Western European countries. That was something that was a success for them, and we still unfortunately see the effects of today.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say about so during the Cold War, a lot of Eastern Europe became democratic for the first time. Like Poland, they were fascist before they were socialists, and a lot of these places now, like Poland and Ukraine, they think they're democratic now, but they were fascist before they were socialists. So they can't go from socialist to democratic. That's why a lot of places like Poland are regressing back into fascism now, is because they were democratic when they were under socialism, but before socialism they never had any type of democracy to begin with. I think that's why a lot of Eastern Europe is regressing back into fascism, like prior to before during World War II.
Yeah, very well said. Thank you for that.
This might be a little bit out of the scope of this class, but to what extent was Spain still fascist when they joined NATO?
All right, no, excellent question. If anybody knows that answer specifically, feel free to raise your hand.
Spain was fascist until about like the mid 70s or early 80s, and so was Portugal. Spain was fascist longer than Portugal, I believe, but they were both fascist for a very long time. So they were definitely still fascist when they joined NATO.
All right, no, thank you for that.
I don't think Spain was a part of NATO, but they did have bases there, but it wasn't like full member. And I think Greece was fascist for a while under the military dictatorship. And anyone have any information about good works about the revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1948? Thanks.
Thank you for that, comrade. All right, Comrade Angelo.
Yeah, in 1948, everybody admits this, the historians. The communists came into power through an election. It was a democratic election. I don't know if people know this. And the communists won. They were the only country that I know of, or the first country in Eastern Europe that happened in. They were not brought in by the Red Army and all that other stuff. That's number one. Number two, Hungary was under the rule of Horthy, General Horthy, who was a local fascist. Poland was under the rule of General Pilsudski, who was a local fascist. So when Germany came into Poland in 1939, they did not invade a democratic state. That's the misunderstanding. It was a fascist state that they just came in to annex. So that's the story I wanted to say there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Angelo.
Yeah, to answer the question about Spain, Franco's dictatorship ended in 1975, and Spain joined NATO in 1982. But there was definitely fascist remnants in Spain. There was Spanish nationalism. But interestingly, Spain was the only country, at least the only one I know of, that joined NATO between the accession of West Germany in 1955 and all of the post-1991 countries that have joined, mostly in Eastern Europe. So yeah, Spain was kind of one out of the blue in the 80s that joined. And I thought that would help to answer the comrade's question.
It's a real shame that the Republic lost, right? It was the dictatorship versus yeah. All right, if there's no other hands, can get to the final part of the presentation, please.
All right, so our last section for tonight. So this is the unipolar world. So starting with NATO, since 1991, showing itself to be non-defensive. So following the counter-revolution in 1991, Russia initially sought to establish cooperative relations with Western institutions, including NATO. In the early post-Cold War period, there were discussions and negotiations between Russia and NATO about the possibility of Russia joining or forming a closer partnership with the alliance. Russian officials expressed interest in integrating Russia into European security structures and overcoming the legacy of Cold War divisions, and NATO officials made remarks and implications that they may let capitalist Russia join. Russian President Boris Yeltsin, in particular, expressed openness to the idea of Russia joining NATO or forming a strategic partnership with the alliance. In a speech to Russian Parliament in 1994, Yeltsin stated, "We must not isolate ourselves from the outside world. Russia's security can only be guaranteed through cooperation with international organizations, primarily NATO. We must strive to establish a full-fledged partnership with NATO, including the possibility of Russia's membership in the alliance." Yeltsin's remarks reflected Russia's desire to engage with NATO and play a constructive role in European security affairs. However, despite initial discussions and expressions of interests, Russia's aspirations to join NATO faced significant challenges and ultimately did not materialize. Yugoslavia. The NATO intervention in Yugoslavia in the 1990s bypassed diplomatic and peaceful means of conflict resolution in favor of military action. NATO's decision to launch airstrikes against Yugoslavia without authorization from the United Nations Security Council was a violation of international law and Yugoslav sovereignty. The intervention set a precedent for unilateral military action by Western powers, undermining the principles of collective security and the peaceful resolution of disputes through diplomacy. Furthermore, the NATO airstrikes contributed to civilian casualties, infrastructure damage, and humanitarian suffering in Yugoslavia, particularly in Kosovo. The bombing campaign, which targeted Yugoslav military and infrastructure, also resulted in unintended consequences, including collateral damage and civilian deaths. NATO's use of force failed to achieve its stated objectives of protecting civilians and resolving the conflict, instead exacerbating tensions and fueling resentment among the local population. Additionally, the NATO intervention deepened divisions within Yugoslavia and hindered prospects for reconciliation and peace in the region. By taking sides in the conflict and supporting one ethnic group over another, NATO's actions further polarized the political landscape and perpetuated cycles of violence and retribution. The intervention also empowered hardline nationalist elements within Yugoslavia, strengthening their grip on power and undermining moderate voices advocating for dialogue and compromise. And I have right here, this was just put up not too long ago, the PCUSA statement on the 25th anniversary of the NATO bombing in Yugoslavia.
All right. The PCUSA statement on the 25th anniversary of the NATO bombing in Yugoslavia. March 24th, 2024 marks the 25th anniversary of the beginning of NATO's 78-day bombing of the former Yugoslavia. NATO undertook these actions without approval from the UN Security Council, making them illegal by international law. The attack was accumulation of the longtime goal of the West to break up the socialist state of Yugoslavia, gain access to gas reserves in the Caspian Sea, and to create a military base in the Balkans. British Prime Minister Tony Blair called the bombing the, quote, the perfect war, end quote. Since no NATO troops were harmed, but 500 Yugoslavian civilians were killed and over 800 were injured. They say that war is politics by other means, and the bombing of Kosovo is no different. The collective West began to destabilize socialist Yugoslavia in the 80s with loans from the IMF that were designed to split the country along historic, regional, and ethnic lines. Interestingly, these loans were taken immediately after President Tito's death. The terms of the aid from the West were that loans could only be made to and repaid from individual states such as Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, etc., not the country as a whole. Furthermore, the states were forced to sell off public lands, assets, to pay the interest on the loans. This caused imbalances and exacerbated pre-existing tensions going back to World War II. As is par for the course for so many U.S. and Western invasions, many lies were used and exaggerated claims were made in the mainstream press to manufacture consent for the bombing. Wild tales of 100,000 Kosovars dead, which later turned out to be probably less than 2,000, tales of sexual abuse against women, some bearing resemblance to recent tales from Israel on October 7th, all culminating in the new debunked Ratak massacre. Witnesses to the recent Bucha hoax in Ukraine will be similar with the basic plot. Furthermore, the U.S. was funding and arming the Kosovo Liberation Army, known as the KLA, even though the KLA was literally on the list of worldwide terror groups. Particularly egregious was the use of depleted uranium munitions, which contaminate the soil and cause radiation poisoning, and cluster bombs, which release pellets that can remain hazardous for years and decades, basically turning villages into minefields. Now, 25 years later, Serbia has the highest cancer rates in Europe due to the use of uranium weapons, low-intensity nuclear warfare. Civilian infrastructure was also heavily targeted during the attack, including a worker-owned car factory, a TV station, and even the Chinese embassy. In addition to being an attack on Yugoslavia, Serbian sovereignty, NATO interventions are also an affront to the sovereignty of the member states. As an example, not a single member of Canadian Parliament was consulted before dragging Canadian planes and pilots into this bombing, much less the Canadian people. Even though in this particular case, no NATO lives were lost, these senseless interventions cost money and resources that should be going to improving the lives of the citizens of the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. For these crimes against Yugoslavia and their citizens, U.S. President Bill Clinton, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and British Prime Minister Tony Blair went free, while Yugoslavian President Milosevic died in captivity before his trial was even concluded. In fact, one of the most vociferous proponents for the illegal and murderous campaign was a ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Joe Biden. We at the Slavic Commission of the Party of Communist USA reject NATO interventions abroad and demand an end to this offensive alliance. We recognize Kosovo to be part of Serbia and respect the sovereignty of the Serbian state, as well as the states of all victims of imperial wars. End the murderous NATO alliance and end all imperial aggressions.
Thank you, comrade.
NATO since 1991. 9/11, Afghanistan, and the War on Terror. When the United States was attacked on September 11, 2001, NATO, for the first and only time in history, invoked Article 5 of the NATO Charter. What followed was a NATO intervention in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, the latter of which was not responsible for the attack. The decision to launch military operations against the Taliban regime and Al-Qaeda without a clear exit strategy or understanding of the long-term consequences were reckless. The use of military force rather than diplomatic and law enforcement measures was a violation of international law. Furthermore, the US-led intervention had a reliance on airstrikes and drone warfare, which resulted in significant civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. The indiscriminate use of force contributed to the suffering of innocent Afghans and undermined efforts to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. This also began an era of reckless Western intervention throughout the Middle East and beyond, known as the War on Terror, of which NATO would participate in. When NATO invaded Afghanistan in 2001, Russia joined alongside them for a time with the purpose of combating terrorism. However, after the illegal US invasion of Iraq, further expansion of NATO towards Russia, Western involvement in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and continued rejection at Russian entry into NATO, Russia began to stray away from NATO and the US, eventually leading to the creation of BRICS and CSTO. Libya. The NATO-led intervention in Libya in 2011, authorized by UN Security Council Resolution 1973, was conducted under the pretext of protecting civilians, but was really for regime change to secure Western interests in Libya and North Africa. The military intervention, which involved airstrikes against the forces of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, was a violation of Libya's sovereignty and a key example of Western interventionism directed by NATO. The NATO intervention in Libya was guilty of enormous amounts of civilian casualties, infrastructure damage, and the proliferation of armed militias. The collapse of the Gaddafi regime led to power vacuums, political fragmentation, and the beginning of open slavery in Libya. It was an infamous example of NATO's aggression and brutality. Furthermore, the intervention failed to achieve its stated humanitarian objectives and exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in Libya, showing NATO's mission to be ludicrous. The lack of post-intervention planning and support for stabilization and reconstruction efforts allowed extremist groups to gain a foothold in Libya, further destabilizing the region and threatening regional security. It is worth noting that Norway, under the leadership of now Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, carried out much of the bombing of Libya during this time. Ukraine, Europe, and the present situation. NATO was long involved in supporting fascist forces in Ukraine since the end of World War II, and especially since 1991. Ukraine applied to join NATO in 2008. When the fascist coup took place in 2013 to 2014 in Ukraine, aided by Western governments, NATO gave its support, and since the beginning of the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, NATO has supported the fascist government, and NATO members have all massively aided Ukraine throughout the war against Russia. This is the closest NATO and Russia have ever been to war. Multiple incidents have nearly resulted in an invocation of Article 5 again. Beyond Ukraine, NATO is very active throughout Europe. NATO has expanded to the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Sweden, and Finland since 1991. Multiple NATO operations are still underway in former Yugoslavia, and Eastern Europe has been upgraded for confrontation with Russia as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence since 2017. NATO also supports the Zionist Israeli government and the various other Western proxies across the world. NATO is resuscitating fascism abroad, increasing the risk of nuclear war, and is wasting the tax dollars of its people and sending them to die to maintain Western imperialism abroad. Now Russia is confronting it, and so must the anti-imperialists the world around. Down with NATO and down with Western imperialism.
All right, well spoken, well said, and we'll stop for our last round of questions and comments. I'm just going to go in the order that the hands came up.
Yeah, quick question, very quick answer. What were the reasons why there was a intervention in Yugoslavia and Libya based on Western propaganda?
All right, if anybody knows that specifically, raise your hand.
Yeah, just a slight correction. Finland didn't join NATO until last year, actually. During the Cold War, they kind of had a trade relationship with the Soviet Union. They were closer with NATO, but they didn't join NATO until just recently. And I think Sweden might have already been a member, but there's some other Nordic states, Nordic social fascists that are thinking about joining.
All right, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, I just wanted to make that small point with that map that was shown. It recognized that Crimea was part of Russia, that it was annexed, but yet it was still labeled or colored yellow as if it was applying to be a part of NATO. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Oh, all right, thank you for that.
Yeah, I remember I was a young adult at that time in Yugoslavia, and it was the propaganda was really heavy. I was trying to get more involved in just following the news, and I didn't know much about what news to follow, so I just read, mainstream media news, and they made it sound as if, oh, these crazy people, in this foreign country just can't get along. They're just like killing each other. There was a heavy element of I don't know if I can't say racism specifically, but really that we're better than them, and that we're coming in, and they really made it sound like we're just going in to save these crazy people from their ancient conflicts that they've had for forever. And you didn't see anything about all the work that they were doing behind the scenes to create the conflict to begin with that our ruling class was doing.
No, very insightful, very insightful.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to suggest there's a documentary, I think it was made in 2010, from a guy that lived in Yugoslavia called The Weight of Chains, that is pretty good about laying out the conflict and showing some of the propaganda, and even our own comrade Michael Parenti is featured in it.
All right, thank you for that. If somebody has a link or some more info, they can put it in chat.
Okay, I was around during the time, active in the peace movement against what was going on in Yugoslavia. Remember, Yugoslavia was the last remaining socialist-run economy in Europe. It was a fact. It was a market socialism, but it was still socialism, so they had to get rid of it. The U.S. had to get rid of it. Remember, when capitalism comes crashing down, people are going to look for alternatives. So the United States made sure they got rid of the last socialist alternative. So now when the economy goes down, people are going to look around. The only thing they're going to see is fascism. And they're going to go to fascism. That's why this whole thing was done. Think about it. That's why they got rid of the Soviet Union and everything. Gaddafi. Gaddafi was a nationalist. He had something called green socialism, if you know anything about him. It was a form of a socialism, not Marxist-Leninism, but a form of Arab socialism. They got rid of him because they wanted the oil. There was oil in a lot of areas there, and they wanted to get rid of it. It's that simple.
2 minutes.
The slogan we gave was "No blood for oil." That was the posters they gave that he brought up to the Congress. It said "No blood for oil," and that was what we were carrying out, those slogans. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Comrade Angelo. Your wisdom is always appreciated.
Yeah, so I guess I haven't heard about a lot of this NATO stuff. I never got this, so I just want book recommendations, please. Give me, if y'all wouldn't mind, yeah, just a few books I should get to read on these subjects. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
No, fair enough. And if anybody has some books, raise your hand up.
Yeah, Comrade Angelo said a lot of what I wanted to say. Another interesting thing about Gaddafi is before they ousted him, he was making plans for a Pan-African currency that would have separated Africa from the dollar and a lot of the other global systems. So that was another reason they wanted him out, or so they say.
Yeah, and I also heard that he wouldn't house anybody until he housed his mother first or something like that. Or he wouldn't house himself until everyone got housing.
Yeah, just two things real quick. First, on book recommendations, there's of course the book that we read from, The Evolution of NATO, Vital Problems of Our Time by Yuri Yuriev. That was on Leninist.org, so you can find that one if you want to read from that. It's in the midst of the Cold War, so it's not going to cover the recent history, but it can give you an idea as to debunking the propaganda that surrounded the start of NATO and the start of the Cold War. But also, Untold History of the U.S. is something we've used a lot before, and it covers a lot of the developments of NATO's wars, and this time even goes all the way up to Libya. So that would be another one that I'd recommend if you're looking into what NATO has, what different texts are out there when it comes to NATO, what media there is. The other thing I wanted to say real quick is it's interesting that countries in Europe that haven't joined NATO yet. As you can imagine, when you list off all the countries that have joined, there's a whole border with Russia now that goes from the Arctic all the way down to Belarusia that is NATO. Belarusia is not NATO, thankfully. They're on Russia's side. Ireland also is not in NATO, which good for the Irish. I'm interested to understand, though, if anybody has any information why Austria and Switzerland aren't in NATO. I know Switzerland always plays neutral, but really profits in the background. But I'm not sure about Austria, just if anybody knows.
No, it's actually a very good question. Thank you for bringing it up.
Thanks for doing this great class. I just wanted to stress that we're on the correct side of history. We were on the correct side of history when we opposed NATO and its creation, and with the connection to Nazis that they have, such as Adolf Husinger that we covered, fourth in command behind Hitler, to our connection and NATO's connection with Nazi Ukraine, where they have Nazi symbols on many of their soldiers' uniforms, to the genocide in Israel and Palestine, to the Iraqi war. We've always been on the correct side of history, and we should be proud of that. And just one other quick thing, I recommend looking up the Fallujah birth defects on Twitter. It's a documentation from the nurses that work at that hospital that was also heavily impacted by depleted uranium rounds. It's disgusting. Thank you.
Minute.
Yeah, no, thank you for that as well.
Yeah, Switzerland is the country that I meant to say earlier that is thinking about joining NATO. Every day it's on the agenda. Yeah.
Right, no, thank you for that correction.
Quick book recommendation that was asked about is To Kill a Nation, The Destruction of Yugoslavia by Michael Parenti.
All right, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to say, you know, we did mention in passing Charles de Gaulle. He truly was, he was almost a French FDR, almost. He was very remarkable. He was pro-capitalist in every sense of the word, yet he had played such a crucial, important role in the Popular Front movement. And his allowance all the way up until a certain point, I believe it was late 70s, when the Communist Party got kicked out of the Popular Front, a coalition government, post-war French government. But ultimately, what he stood for in principle, you know, we owe, you know, there are certain people we owe our lives to, you know, especially for us who are happy we're not speaking German, you know. One of them is Stalin, and another one, a really big honorable mention is de Gaulle. That's all.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, for other recommendations, we mentioned this at the U.S. Friends of the Soviet Union Congress, which is North Star Compass, or Comrades in Canada, that have written a lot of good stuff after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I know I've mentioned this before, it's anecdotal. I remember last year during May Day, someone was interested in or anti-NATO message, and I just can't get it out of my head, but they said, well, if it wasn't for NATO, I think they were being argumentative, but if it wasn't for NATO, we would all be communists. I just had to be like, well, all right, but that's all.
Thank you for that, comrade.
I want you to understand clearly that Yugoslavia had one section that supported Nazi Germany when they invaded, and that was called Croatia. Ukraine also had an area that supported Nazi Germany, and that was the Bandera people in the Ukraine, in the city of Lvov, which is in western Ukraine. They were both used by the fascists. It's not a coincidence that those were the areas that were used to destroy their countries. That's all.
Yeah, I knew Croatian once in high school, and he would scratch the red star off of every Heineken beer. So
exactly.
Yeah, part of it was another good place to go to read about NATO is the Daily Worker website, dailyworkerusa.com. We've put out tons of different articles and statements regarding NATO, both recent and just their history in general, and encompassing a lot of things, a lot of NATO's hypocrisy, even on certain issues. So you can check that out. We've done different classes on NATO before that you can find on our YouTube. And the other thing that I wanted to bring up is I wasn't able to get it into the presentation, but of course, in our History of U.S. Imperialism series, we were reminded that during the Trump administration, there was some sort of strife between the United States and NATO, basically where Trump was saying, you're not putting in as much as you should. We're picking up the tab, and meanwhile, you're just kind of writing free. And I remember in the
60
video of
seconds?
that meeting, Stoltenberg sitting there basically trying to bend over backwards for Trump and saying, "Oh no, we'll pay more now. We'll pay more," you know. And Trump was criticizing. And I don't think that Trump is actually like an anti-NATO person in general. But the thing is that there still is these internal strife that exists in NATO, and I think that we can exploit that. And I think that the calls for U.S. out of NATO or to abolish NATO or defund NATO or what, you know, whatever people are saying to resist NATO is a positive thing. And wherever there's anti-NATO forces, including this summer, we should be there
2
beside them.
minutes.
All right. Thank you for that, Comrade. And Comrade, if you can keep it to 60 seconds, we have some wrap-up slides, but you have the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that or ask. I think Bernie Sanders did vote to bomb Yugoslavia. Is that right? Thank you.
Correct.
All right. Simple and sweet.
Yeah, I just wanted to correct that and expand on that and say you can actually look up and find the video of Bernie Sanders sitting there arguing for bombing people. It's crazy to think that, you know, we thought this man was so progressive and so anti-war. But just like other people that claim to be progressive and voted for the Iraq War to send weapons to Israel now or whatever, you can see just how false that anti-war facade is. So thank you for bringing that up, though, Comrade.
Yes, and just in chat here, we brought up the No to NATO rally, if anybody has the specific dates for that. And yeah, thank you for joining, and we'll sign off. Thank you for watching this full-length class from the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. For more information, or to join our free classes, visit our website, check out our YouTube, listen to our streams on Spotify, and chat with us on Reddit.